Shadow work has a problem, not the practice itself. The practice is one of the most important things a human being can do. The problem is what shadow work has become in the cultural conversation: a hashtag, an aesthetic, a badge of spiritual identity, something people say they do while continuing to unconsciously project everything they have not integrated onto the people around them. And I want to be fair because many people who engage with shadow work are doing so with real sincerity and real courage. Going into the shadow is not comfortable. It demands a lot of you, but sincerity is not the same as depth. And the version of shadow work that circulates most widely is often missing something essential. It stops at excavation, it never arrives at alchemy. And that distinction between digging up what is buried and actually transforming it is everything. Today, I want to walk you through what genuine alchemical shadow work actually involves, what it demands, what it produces, and why it is the only form of inner work that actually changes the soil rather than just tending the surface. I am Jonathan. Welcome back to my channel, Alchemy of Remembrance. The concept of the shadow comes primarily from Carl Jung, though the idea itself is ancient and appears in one form or another in virtually every wisdom tradition on earth. Jung described the shadow as the sum of everything a person refuses to acknowledge about themselves, not just the dark. That is the common misunderstanding. The shadow contains everything that was exiled from the acceptable self. That includes rage, yes, but it also includes grief that was never allowed, desires that were shamed, capacities that were not mirrored or valued, creative power that was beaten back by criticism, the parts of you that were too much or not enough for the people you needed most. The shadow is not your enemy, it is the exiled. And like all exiles, it does not simply disappear because it was sent away. It lives at the border. It sends messages through dreams, through sudden, inexplicable emotions, through the people who trigger you most intensely, through the patterns that keep repeating in your life without your conscious permission. And here is the key principle: what you do not own in yourself, you will project onto the world. The person who cannot own their own anger will keep meeting angry people. The person who cannot acknowledge their own envy will feel perpetually wronged. The person who cannot access their own power will either collapse in the presence of powerful people or become obsessed with tearing them down. The trigger is always the teacher, because the intensity of your reaction to something outside you is almost always in direct proportion to the size of the unacknowledged part inside you that it is touching. This is not comfortable to hear. It is not meant to be. But it is one of the most practically useful things I know. Before we go further, I want to give you a more precise anatomy of shadow. Because most popular treatments describe shadow as a single undifferentiated darkness. But the actual literature, from Jung through to the contemporary body of depth psychology, identifies several distinct types, each operating through a different mechanism. Understanding the difference is not academic. It changes how you work with each one. The first is the personal shadow, what we have already described. The content exiled from the acceptable self during the formation of identity. This is primarily what Jungian analysis addresses. James Hollis, one of the most serious working Jungian analysts of our time, describes it as the unlived life, everything that was suppressed, denied, or sacrificed in order to become the person your environment required you to be. Hollis writes in Swamplands of the Soul that the shadow is not our problem, it is our underdevelopment. The language is precise, not a pathology to be removed, but a dimension of self that has not been brought into conscious relationship. The second type is what Jung called the golden shadow, and this one is more surprising. We shadow not only what is dark, but also what is luminous. The gifts that were not safe to carry, the intelligence that was mocked, the creativity that was dismissed, the sensitivity that was called weakness. These two go into the bag. Robert Bly, the American poet and depth psychologist, gave this image its most memorable form in a little book on the human shadow. He wrote that when we are children, we have a 360-degree personality, curious, alive, and capacious in all directions. But the adults around us communicate in dozens of ways which parts of us are acceptable. The rest goes into an invisible bag we drag behind us. And by the time we are 20, he says, we have put the best things in the bag. Robert Johnson, in Owning Your Own Shadow, extends this really nicely. He observes that we project not only our darkness but our unlived potential. The person we idealize is almost always carrying a projection of our own disowned capacities. The teacher we worship has intelligence we refuse to claim as our own. The artist we envy is expressing something we suppressed in ourselves long ago. The romantic partner who seems to complete us is often carrying the qualities our one sided identity could not accommodate. This matters enormously for practical inner work. Withdrawing a golden shadow projection is just as important, and often just as difficult as withdrawing a dark one. Because the idealized figure carries something that belongs to you, and as long as it lives outside you, in them, it remains inaccessible to you. Now, the mechanics of projection itself, because this is where the work gets deeper. A projection always has a specific signature. Three qualities distinguish it from ordinary perception. First, the emotional charge is disproportionate to what is actually present. The reaction is too large for the stimulus. Then, second, a quality of not me, a sense that what you are seeing is entirely outside of yourself with no inner equivalent. And third, a compulsive quality. You cannot look away, cannot let it go, you return to it repeatedly, even when you would prefer not to. When all three of these are present simultaneously, you are almost certainly in the territory of projection. Johnson offers a three-step method for working with this. First, acknowledge that the hook in the other person is real. You are not imagining them entirely, but recognize that the charge belongs to you, not to them. Their quality is merely the occasion for your reaction. Second, ask honestly, where is this quality in me? Not as accusation, but as genuine inquiry. If I am furious at someone's arrogance, where is my own unexpressed self assertion living? If I am contemptuous of someone's neediness, where is my own unmet longing hiding? Third, decide consciously what to do with the energy now that it has been reclaimed. Not to enact it impulsively, but to integrate it, to find the healthy form in which this quality can live in your life. The third major category is the introject, and this one comes primarily from Fritz Perls and the Gestalt tradition, rather than from Jung, though the overlap is significant. Perls drew a crucial distinction between metabolized experience and swallowed experience. Healthy psychological digestion, like physical digestion, means chewing carefully, taking in what nourishes, spitting out what does not, and making what remains genuinely your own. An introject, by contrast, is content swallowed whole, something taken in from a significant other, a parent, a teacher, a religious authority, a culture, without being properly examined or made one's own. The introject does not feel like someone else's voice, it feels like your own thoughts. This is precisely what makes it so difficult to identify, but it has a distinctive quality once you learn to listen for it. It speaks in imperatives. You should, you must, you ought, you never, you always. It applies punishments for transgression, guilt, shame, anxiety that seem to arrive automatically without any conscious evaluation. It tends to reproduce rules from a context that no longer exists, enforcing a social environment that may have been relevant at 7 years old but has no bearing on the present. The inner critic, now that persistent internal voice that evaluates, judges, and finds you insufficient, is in almost every case an introject. It is not your voice, it is the voice of someone specific from your past, absorbed so thoroughly that it migrated inward and began presenting itself as your own self assessment. Identifying whose voice it actually is and recognizing that it belongs to a historical context, not to the present reality, is one of the most liberating moves in the whole of inner work. Disowning an introject does not mean rejecting all values or becoming morally rudderless. It means subjecting the swallowed content to conscious examination. What of this actually resonates with my genuine experience? What is genuinely mine, metabolized, integrated, felt as true? And what is simply the echo of someone else's fear or limitation, still running in my system because it never got examined? The fourth framework I want to offer here is, in some ways, the most practically usable: the work of Hal Stone and Sidra Stone, developed over decades of clinical practice and published in their foundational text, Embracing Our Dark Side. They proposed that the psyche is not a single unified entity, but something more like a family, a population of semi autonomous sub personalities, each with its own history, its own agenda, its own emotional logic. Stone and Stone made a crucial distinction between primary selves and disowned selves. Primary selves are the sub personalities that were built up during childhood in response to the environment, the parts that were rewarded, valued, and encouraged until they became central to identity: the inner critic, the perfectionist, the responsible one, the pleaser, the protector controller. These are the selves that run the show. We tend to identify with them completely, to experience them as simply who we are. But here is the key insight: every primary self creates its exact opposite as a disowned self. The more entrenched the responsible one becomes, the more the irresponsible, spontaneous self gets exiled, surfacing only in fantasies of escape or in periodic eruptions that then produce shame. The more the pleaser controls behavior, the more the furious self accumulates in the shadow until it breaks through disproportionately in a situation that finally exceeds the pleaser's capacity to manage. This framework explains something that puzzles people endlessly about themselves. Why do I sometimes act in ways that seem completely out of character? Why does this quality I despise in others keep showing up in me? Because the disowned self has not disappeared. It has gone underground. And underground does not mean inactive. It means active without consciousness, active without your cooperation. The method Stone and Stone developed, voice dialogue, works by giving each sub-personality a direct voice, not to give it control, but to hear what it carries, what it needs, what gift is locked inside its exile. The inner critic, when finally given genuine space to speak, often turns out to be carrying something important: a fierce care for quality, a protective vigilance against failure. The angry, disowned self is often carrying a legitimate boundary, a genuine grievance, a self respect that was never allowed its proper expression. The goal of this work is not to eliminate the primary selves or to give the disowned selves unchecked authority. The goal is what they call the aware ego, a position of witness that can relate to all the sub-personalities consciously, moving between them with awareness rather than being automatically run by whichever one has seized the wheel. The aware ego is not itself a subpersonality. It is the capacity to hold the full range of the inner family without being enslaved to any single member of it. Well, we now have a fairly complete picture of what shadow material consists of. But knowing the territory is not the same as knowing how to move through it. And this is where a framework drawn from several converging traditions becomes genuinely useful, a framework that most popular shadow work never mentions. It is the framework of perspectives, the recognition that any piece of psychological or shadow material can be approached from four distinct vantage points, each of which reveals something the others cannot. Ken Wilber's integral framework maps these as the four quadrants. NLP, the neuro linguistic programming, not natural language processing, describes the same territory as perceptual positions. Developmental psychologists like Robert Kegan and Suzanne Cook Greuter track the capacity to take multiple perspectives as one of the primary markers of psychological maturity. These frameworks differ in emphasis but converge on the same basic structure. The first perspective is the first person, the I. This is your own interior, subjective experience of the shadow material. What you feel in the body, the texture of the emotion, the specific quality of the charge when the trigger fires. Right. Most people default to this perspective and stay there entirely, which is partly why shadow work can circle indefinitely without resolution. You are swimming in the feeling without ever being able to see it clearly. So, first person work is essential as a starting point. Somatic therapy, felt sense work, breath work, and deep emotional processing all operate primarily in this register. This is where the shadow is actually felt rather than merely described. Without this embodied engagement, everything else remains intellectual. But staying only in the first person keeps you inside the experience without the perspective needed to work with it. The second perspective is the second person, the you. This is the relational dimension, the shadow, as it lives between you and another person. This is the perspective that asks, what is the experience of the person on the receiving end of my shadow? What is it like to be someone who loves me and encounters the part of me I have not integrated? This perspective is where genuine empathy becomes a tool of shadow work rather than a virtue performed socially. When I can genuinely step into the experience of the person who has been receiving my projection, my displaced anger, my withdrawal, my controlling protector, my fawning self, something in the defensive structure begins to soften. Because the shadow, when seen from the second person perspective, loses its anonymity. It is no longer just my inner material. It is something that is affecting a real person in a real relationship. That recognition has a particular quality of accountability that purely first person introspection rarely produces. The voice dialogue work of Stone and Stone operates significantly in this second person register, sitting opposite the disowned self not as an interior experience but as a genuine encounter. The subpersonality speaks, the aware ego listens. The relational quality of the engagement is precisely what makes it more metabolizable than pure introspection. The third perspective is the third person, the observer position. This is where you step fully outside the first person experience and watch yourself as if watching a character in a film, not coldly, not dissociatively, but with the genuine detachment of a compassionate witness who is no longer inside the pattern being observed. From the third person position, the mechanics of the pattern become visible in a way they simply cannot be from inside it. You can see the trigger response loop running. You can observe which subpersonality has taken the wheel. You can watch the introject activating and recognize it as an old voice from a historical context rather than a present truth. The Gestalt technique of the empty chair works primarily in this register, externalizing the internal dynamic onto a physical space, which creates enough distance for the third person witness to actually see what is happening. This third person perspective is also the position from which projection withdrawal becomes possible. As long as you are entirely inside the first person charge, entirely fused with the anger, the judgment, the idealization, withdrawal is not available. The charge simply runs. But from the third person observer position, you can watch the charge arise, recognize its disproportionate quality, and ask the reclaiming question: where is this in me? That is Johnson's three-step method, described earlier, enacted from the third person vantage point. The fourth perspective is the most frequently overlooked, and in some ways the most important for the kind of work this channel explores. It is the fourth person: the we, the collective, the field, the system. The fourth person perspective recognizes that individual shadow material does not exist in isolation. It exists inside a collective field that is itself carrying shadow: the cultural shadow, the ancestral shadow, the shared, unacknowledged material of families, lineages, communities, and civilizations. This is the territory we will go into in depth when we reach the ancestral healing video. But it is introduced here because it changes the relationship to personal shadow work significantly. When you work with the fourth person perspective on your own shadow, you begin asking a different order of questions. Not only, where did this pattern come from in my personal history, but what collective field am I carrying this on behalf of? What cultural narrative is running through me? What has never been grieved or acknowledged in the lineage that I am now feeling in my body as if it were purely mine? Jung himself pointed toward this in his concept of the collective unconscious, the layer of the psyche that is not personal but shared across all of humanity, carrying the accumulated patterns of human experience in the form of archetypes. The egregores we explored in a later video are, in one sense, the fourth person shadow made tangible: collective thought forms carrying unprocessed collective material, influencing individuals who do not know they are being influenced. A genuinely complete shadow practice moves fluidly through all four perspectives. You feel the material in the first person, the somatic, embodied, real charge. You bring it into the second person, the relational encounter, the accountability to the other, the empathic recognition of the impact. You step into the third person, the witnessing observer who can see the pattern from outside and withdraw the projection. And you hold the fourth person, the awareness that this material is also collective, also ancestral, also cultural, and that your integration of it is not merely personal. It sends ripples into the field. Most people are chronically stuck in one perspective. The intellectualizer stays in the third person indefinitely, always the observer, never the one who feels. The person in chronic emotional process stays in the first person, always swimming in the material, never able to witness it. The relational obsessive stays in the second person, always focused on the dynamic with the other, never addressing what their own field is bringing to it. And almost everyone neglects the fourth person entirely, treating their shadow as a purely private matter when it is, in part, a collective inheritance asking to be made conscious. The aware ego that Stone and Stone describe is, in this framework, precisely the capacity to move between all four perspectives fluidly, not as a fixed position, but as a living responsiveness to what the shadow material actually needs in any given moment. Sometimes it needs to be felt, sometimes it needs to be witnessed, sometimes it needs to be brought into relationship, and sometimes it needs to be recognized as something larger than personal, held in the fourth person with humility and with the understanding that your healing participates in a much wider restoration. So, let me now come to the topics of excavation and alchemy. Excavation first. This is the part most shadow work frameworks teach. Excavation means becoming aware of the shadow content, noticing your patterns, identifying your triggers, looking honestly at your projections, sitting with the emotions you usually avoid, exploring the origins of your adaptations. This is necessary work, absolutely necessary. But here is what excavation alone produces if it stops there: an increasingly sophisticated map of your wounds with no change in the territory. I have met people who have been in therapy for 15 years and can describe their attachment style, their inner child wound, their trauma responses, their family constellation, their core beliefs with extraordinary precision and articulation. And then they walk out of the session and make the exact same choices they made 15 years ago. Knowledge about a wound is not the same as the wound healing. In fact, there is a danger that is rarely discussed. Prolonged excavation without integration can deepen identification with the wound. The person starts to become their trauma. Their identity consolidates around being a person who has this wound, who struggles with this pattern, who carries this darkness. The excavation becomes the container, and the container, paradoxically, preserves what it is supposed to dissolve. John Wellwood, the psychotherapist who coined the term spiritual bypassing, observed that people can use even sophisticated psychological frameworks in the service of avoidance. The person who has spent years learning the language of the shadow without ever genuinely sitting in the fire of their own disowned material is using the framework as another form of management, understanding the mechanism of the introject while the introject continues to run everything, identifying the projection while the projection continues to distort every relationship. Alchemy is different in character. The old alchemists used the metaphor of transmuting lead into gold. This was never primarily about chemistry, or it was a description of an inner process. Lead is the heavy, dense, unredeemed material of the psyche. Gold is not the absence of that material, it is the same material transformed, held in the fire long enough to release what it was carrying. Alchemy requires three things that excavation alone does not provide. It requires fire, the willingness to stay present with intensity without fleeing. It requires the vessel, a stable enough inner container to hold the process without fragmenting. And it requires time, the patience to allow transformation to happen at its own pace rather than forcing resolution. Integration is the gold, not the absence of shadow, but shadow that has been met, held, understood, and allowed to contribute its gifts rather than drive behavior from the basement. Now, there is a phase in genuine alchemical work that almost no spiritual content creator talks about honestly because it is not aesthetically appealing, it does not produce good content, and it is the uncomfortable truth. It is the phase where it gets worse before it gets better. When you begin working at the level of the deep mind, when you start genuinely touching the patterns rather than just describing them, things move. Old structures start shifting. And when structures shift, things that were held in place by those structures begin to surface. This is what Saint John of the Cross called the dark night of the soul. And I want to be precise about what it is and what it is not, because it is one of the most misused phrases in spiritual language. The dark night is not depression, though it can look like depression from the outside. It is not a spiritual crisis in the colloquial sense. It is an initiation. It is the ego's encounter with its own finitude, the collapse of identities, beliefs, relationships, and structures that could no longer support the growth that is trying to happen. To the ego, this feels like annihilation. Old certainties dissolve. Spiritual practices that once provided comfort stop working. The sense of direction disappears. What used to feel meaningful feels hollow. And if you resist it, if you try to force order back prematurely, to reconstruct the old self, to fill the space with spiritual bypassing or excessive activity you extended. Because what the Dark Knight is trying to do is create space. Space that the ego, in its defended state, would never voluntarily create. There is an even deeper phase beyond this, which I call the Black Sun initiation, where even the spiritual consolations, deities, gurus disappear, where all the so called performance of spirituality is stripped away, where you cannot present yourself as someone who is on a glorious path because the path itself becomes invisible. What remains is only the raw material of who you actually are beneath all the identities you carried. The outer sun disappears, and all that can shine now is the inner sun, which shines for itself, not for others. And through this process, you are totally reborn by walking through the dark cosmic waters where you found your true, sovereign, authentic, fully remembered self. This is the initiation of Goddess Kali. But this is not a place you arrive at by seeking it. It arrives when you are ready for it, or sometimes just before you think you are ready. And if met with honesty rather than performance, it produces something that nothing else can produce: a light that does not need validation, a stability that does not depend on conditions, a sovereignty that comes from having been dissolved into the void and being reborn. And that is the gold. Well, I want to get practical now because everything I have said so far is only useful if it connects to something you can actually do. Now, let me be clear here. The inner child is not simply a therapeutic metaphor, it is the layer of the psyche that formed before your defenses solidified, before you learned to perform, to protect, to manage how you appeared. It is the part that still carries the original texture of your longing, what you most needed and what you most feared. And in most people, this part is not living in the present. It is living in the past, still waiting for the safety, the love, the recognition, the consistency that it needed and did not reliably receive. And from that place, it quietly orchestrates situations that give it another chance to receive what it was waiting for. And it doesn't care about logic, ration, and all. It is a child seeking attention. This is why adult relationships often have a quality of repetition that feels almost like a programmed loop. You are not just relating to the person in front of you, you are also, underneath, enacting an old script with old players, hoping this time it will end differently. Reparenting means becoming the parent of this part of you, which never had one, not through imagining an idealized fantasy world, but through specific, consistent, real acts of inner care. It means noticing when the inner child is activated, usually felt as a disproportionate emotional reaction, a sudden collapse in confidence, a desperate need for reassurance, and instead of overriding it or being ashamed of it, turning toward it, asking, what is happening here? What does this part need right now? It means providing what was absent. If what was absent was safety, you create it through boundaries, through removing yourself from situations that are chronically re traumatizing. If what was absent was validation, you practice giving it to yourself directly without waiting for external permission. If what was absent was presence, you practice the act of being with your own experience without immediately moving away from it. You can start consciously identifying and writing down the beliefs and the life patterns that you identify yourself with. Like, I always get a narcissistic boss figure at work because I have fawned on my father my whole life and tried to please him. Then you immediately rewrite the opposite scenario and start living your life accordingly. If through fawning you pushed away your hobbies, your favorite activities, food, etc., you start embracing them in order to make the inner child happy, to nurture that unfulfilled self of yours. But remember, excavating the shadow side, which didn't get your attention so far, is one thing. But real healing from the trauma happens when your nervous system is reprogrammed over a good enough time. Conscious behavioral changes need to happen in how you react, what you choose in default vulnerable situations. Does your shadow still take over your default mode behavior? Or are you being able to come to a democratic, peaceful relationship with your split ego states? Are you still projecting the shadow onto others? Are you still being run by the introjects? Most importantly, you can't be aggressive with your shadow. You need unconditional love for that inner child. One must maintain a non judgmental observer's position with extreme loving kindness. And more importantly, one must have the fluidity to adopt different perspectives and build their tolerance for discomfort, holding paradoxical truths. And throughout this journey, I have seen many things come in handy and prove extremely useful, like during the excavation and transmutation of the traumas. I often combine Bach flower therapy, crystal meditations, especially obsidian, onyx, herbalism, and essential oils. Then, depending upon an individual's background and the nature of the shadow, connecting to specific deities, performing some high magic rituals to clear the path, mindfulness practices, psychic protection, all play interesting roles. It is truly a multimodal psycho spiritual journey. All these may sound quite gentle, and in some ways it is. But please do not mistake gentleness for ease. Learning to be present with your own pain without fleeing or collapsing into it is one of the most demanding things a human being can do. It goes against every survival adaptation the deep mind installed to keep you functional. But when it begins to work, when the inner child really starts to experience a different kind of environment inside you, everything in the outer world begins to shift as well. Because the deep mind has been given new data. The old story starts to lose its authority. Let me close this transmission with a distinction that I think is at the heart of everything this channel is about. There are two fundamental orientations from which a human being can inhabit their life. I call them victim consciousness and creator consciousness. And I want to be clear, I am not using victim in a dismissive way. Real victimization is real. Real harm has been done to real people, and that deserves to be honored, not minimized. What I am pointing to is an orientation of the self in relation to experience, not a judgment about what happened, but about where you locate your agency in response to it. Victim consciousness, in the sense I use it, says, "This was done to me, and therefore I am at the mercy of what happens." It locates power entirely outside the self, and the consequence of this, regardless of whether it is an accurate description of past events, is that the person becomes programmable, reactive, easy to steer through fear, validation, and the constant search for a savior or a scapegoat. Creator consciousness is not the opposite extreme of arrogantly claiming you control everything. That would simply be the ego's inflated response to the same root insecurity. Creator consciousness is something quieter and more precise. It is the recognition that, regardless of what happened and regardless of what is still happening, there is always something in the response that belongs to me, something that I can choose differently and ultimately ascend. Not omnipotence, not magical thinking, but sovereignty, the refusal to outsource my center. And this is where the alchemy connects to the political, to the collective, to the larger world. Because a population kept in victim consciousness, in trauma bonding, in fawning, is a population that can be permanently steered through fear, shame, and the promise of rescue. And the matrix, inner and outer, depends on exactly that. Every person who does this work, who genuinely integrates their shadow in all its forms, who withdraws their projections and reclaims the golden shadow, who metabolizes their introjects rather than obeying them, who develops their aware ego that can hold all the inner subpersonalities without being enslaved by any of them, that person becomes less programmable. Not enlightened, not above it all, not perfect, but harder to hook to the matrix manipulations. More present, more free, more alive, and living in tune with their individual soul blueprint, more aware of the false game and the ascension. That is what the alchemy produces. Not a life without difficulty, but a life lived from a different center. I said at the beginning that shadow work has a problem, that most of what circulates under that name stops at excavation and never reaches alchemy. I hope today has given you a sense of both what the process actually contains, the personal shadow, the golden shadow, the mechanisms of projection, the introjects, the disowned selves, and what it means to work with all of it, not just as material to be excavated, but as material to be transformed. The literature worth checking if you want to go further: Jung's Ion and two essays on analytical psychology for the foundational theory, Robert Johnson's Owning Your Own Shadow for the most accessible and practically direct treatment of projection work, Robert Bly's little book on the human shadow for the golden shadow and the image of the bag, Fritz Perls for the somatic and relational dimensions of introject work, and Hal and Sidra Stone's Embracing Our Dark Side for Voice Dialogue and the Model of the Inner Family. These are definitely not light reads, I must warn, but they are honest ones, and they will take the work significantly deeper. I am Jonathan. This is Alchemy of Remembrance. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I will see you in the next video. Have a great day ahead. Peace and love.